Welcome back into Live Now from Fox. I'm Austin Westfall. Let's get the latest on the Israel-Hamas war. And for that, we turn to Alon Burstein. As always, Alon, it's good to see you and welcome back. A lot to get to, as always. I want to start off with Sunday. Sunday marked 9 months of fighting. It marked 9 months of the war. And let's remember the IDF's main objectives from the beginning. It was to, A, eliminate Hamas, and B, rescue the hostages. As we sit here now, 3/4 of a year on, how much progress have they made, Alon?
First of all, it's good to see you again. It's been a while. Complicated question. When we think about it, when the war started, the goals that were set by Israel were not actually those two things that you said. It was defeating Hamas, and then it was explicitly said as a second tier, returning the hostages. Now, politically, that was not viable, and then they changed it to no. The goal is tantamount. Returning the hostages and defeating Hamas, they go together. Then, as the war dragged on, the rhetoric in Israel changed. From defeating Hamas, it changed to eliminating Hamas's governing and military capability. That is very different than defeating an organization. Saying the organization will no longer be able to govern the Gaza Strip and will no longer have military capabilities. After that, it was also changed a little bit, and I'm talking about what the official line in Israel is, the goals of the war, also changed a little bit, and it said to ensure that Gaza is no longer a threat. So what are the goals of the war is constantly shifting. In terms of what the IDF is managing to accomplish, look, in terms of returning the hostages, there were initially roughly 253 hostages that were kidnapped on October 7th. And I say roughly because the number, first of all, includes 4 hostages. There are Israelis that were in Gaza, 2 bodies of soldiers from 2014, and 2 other Israelis that were from before. They're counted within the hostages. And in addition to that, there have been at least, I can say, 2 or 3 cases where people were presumed kidnapped, but it actually turns out they were killed on October 7th and their bodies were found in Israel. So roughly 253 hostages were taken on October 7th. Of them, the IDF has actually managed to rescue in military operation not that many. The vast majority of hostages that came back in the hostage deal of the end of November. So one can say that the hostage deals is a result of the military pressure, but the fact is that the military pressure is not actually bringing the hostages back in terms of rescuing them. It may be creating the conditions in order to bring about hostage deals. Now, the second part of that is defeating Hamas. In that, the IDF can claim a lot more successes. The amount of battalions that Hamas had has shrunk significantly. From 24 active battalions, we're now talking about likely 6, give or take, and even less, probably by now 4, those go on Rafah, active battalions. That doesn't mean that all of the other fighters are killed, but the battalions, the command structure, the military structure is destroyed. Think of the United States military. In order to defeat the military, let's say there's a military battalion somewhere, you don't need to kill every soldier. You need the battalion to stop functioning, people to scatter, people to stop working as soldiers together. So in that sense, a lot of Hamas's structure has been dismantled over the last 9 months. At the same time, what the IDF is seeing and is constantly saying and is constantly begging the Israeli leadership to come up with is an alternative administration in Gaza. Because what the IDF is constantly saying, it is managing to defeat Hamas. It defeated Hamas in northern Gaza, in Gaza City. It defeated Hamas in Khan Yunis. It is defeating Hamas in Rafah. In all of these places, because there's a power vacuum, because the Israeli government has not decided what happens next, every time the IDF pulls out, Hamas is rebuilding. The IDF put out some very disturbing figures in the last week. It started to say that Hamas is not only rebuilding its military infrastructure in the north of Gaza, in Sajaiya, but in Khan Yunis, they're not only rebuilding their tunnels, they have actually managed to recreate their concrete factories in order to start rebuilding the concrete, reproducing the concrete in order to rebuild the tunnels. This is while the war is going on. So that's really the problem. The IDF is managing to defeat Hamas, but without a game plan for what happens next in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is just rebuilding during the war. You can only imagine what will happen once the war is over.
Do we know how they are cooperating? How is Hamas communicating with one another? How are they working together in order to even achieve anything at this point? The IDF has combed through so much of Gaza at this point. We watched them as they moved further and further south over the months, and now we've watched them as they've started ordering more evacuations further up north. What exactly is in place that allows Hamas to still collectively do things like rebuild some of the ideas that you're talking about right now?
So, one of the things that is very complicated to understand is that Hamas operates as a terrorist group and as a fully functional, I would say, quote unquote, Western bureaucratic government, right? They've been governing Gaza since 2007. So while the military capabilities are in fact taking a hit, and we can talk about how Hamas is still able to also retrain people, they've also reestablished weapons manufacturing capabilities. While that is part of their weapons thing, that is what the IDF is focusing on. When I say that Hamas is rebuilding, that means that the Ministry of Infrastructure is starting to rebuild. When someone works for the state, right? The state in most places is the biggest employer. If someone works for the state in the Gaza Strip, they're working for Hamas because Hamas is the government. That doesn't mean they're a Hamas supporter. But if you go to work in a factory, if all of a sudden a job opens up because Han Yunis has been completely destroyed, you're now come back to Han Yunis, your job is destroyed, a job is opened up in a factory, and you're doing something to produce concrete, you're doing that. As far as you're concerned, you could be doing that in order to rebuild the buildings there. Yes, but the one who's employing you is a government agency that ends up filtering back to Hamas. They want to divert that concrete also to somewhat rebuilding their buildings, but mostly to rebuilding their tunnels. So that is why the IDF keeps on saying it doesn't help to defeat Hamas over and over militarily. You need a different governing apparatus. You need a different government in place. You need something there because every time the IDF defeats Hamas militarily, and it has done so effectively throughout Gaza City, which is the entire north, in areas of the central parts of the Gaza Strip, in Han Yunis, and soon in Rafah. But every time it pulls out, Hamas rebuilds because effectively everything that happens that is part of the government infrastructure ends up filtering back to Hamas in one way or another. And that is how, without putting in some other governing apparatus in play, Hamas is going to come back. And they have openly said that again and again. That is the reason that they are advocating for, in this hostage deal, which we will talk about, they are calling for a complete ceasefire and end to the war because, as far as they're concerned, it doesn't matter how destroyed Gaza is. They'll be back because they are the only governing apparatus in the area.
And this kind of leads me to my next question here. After 9 months of fighting and the destruction of huge swaths of Gaza, many Hamas leaders do remain at large, including its top commander in the enclave, Yahya Sinwar. How is it that after all this time, we still haven't heard any significant information about his whereabouts Alone?
Look, Yahya Sinwar has proven on October 7th, and even before that, to be very smart. He outsmarted the entire IDF. The Mossad, this is the famous Mossad that is capable of doing things all across the world, but in their own backyard in Gaza, he was capable of pulling off what Hamas pulled off. I'll say even more than that. He outsmarted Hamas. The external leadership of Hamas had no idea that October 7th was coming the way it was coming. He did not tell them. He was able to build this up and to keep it secret. Think about that. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of fighters able to keep it entirely secret. He's very smart. He knows how to operate. One of the things that he has done, according to at least different reports, is there are only roughly 2 to 3 people in the Gaza Strip who know Sinwar's whereabouts, and they're complete loyalists. Sinwar and Mohammed Def, the leader of the Al Qassam brigades. Those are the two most wanted people in the Gaza Strip. There are only 2 or 3 people who know his whereabouts. According to at least reports, he is surrounded by hostages, acting as human shields. Does the IDF know where he is? Honestly, I doubt it, because I think if they did, they would probably risk a lot in order to try to get to his whereabouts. However, he has proven to be very smart. He's proven to know what is happening. The intelligence units of Hamas have proven to actually be able to anticipate what the IDF is going to do. We saw this on October 7th, and we've seen this during the fighting, particularly in Rafah. We have seen Hamas learn and evolve. There have been more soldiers killed in Rafah in certain operations than in other attacks combined over a large amount of time. And the reason is that Hamas has learned. It has seen how the IDF is operating within the Gaza Strip and then implemented its new tactics in Rafah. Similarly, Sinwar seems to know how to manipulate the IDF. Is he hiding in a tunnel in Rafah? Or, I wouldn't be surprised if we find out that actually he's been in an apartment in Han Yunis this entire time. I don't know. Um, but what we do know is the IDF is investing a hell of a lot of information, intelligence, and money and time to try to find him. I genuinely do not think that they know where he is at this point.
Some members of the international media were able to take a tour of Rafah, including Fox's Trey Yingst. They were invited to survey the damage and hear about the IDF's progress in the southern city. I read some reporting from CBS that the IDF found underground connections between Gaza and Egypt. I know it's no surprise to you. I know it's common knowledge that there's been smuggling efforts underneath that border, but do we know for a fact that top Hamas leaders didn't bail under the border alone?
We don't know that for a fact. I would argue that it would be very surprising if they did. Hamas is different than a lot of different organizations in the world in the sense that it is both nationalistic and religious. So it has religious fanaticism within it, but it's also very Palestinian. It is very, very loyal to the ground. And one of its claims to fame, one of the reasons it has been able to be very popular among the Palestinian population, as opposed to Fatah and the PLO, Yasser Arafat, is that they have always said, we will die for the cause. We will not do anything. We will not accept any bribes, any money, any fame, any diplomatic position, any titles that Israel would rather give us. We will die before we give up the cause, before we give up our location, before we give up Palestine, so to speak. And in that sense, it would be surprising if the Hamas leadership actually fled the Gaza Strip, because maybe this would be in their interest in terms of maybe when a gun's actually pointed at your head, people will choose their life over ideology. However, historically, most organizations like this would actually rather die as they are fighting for their cause and as they are fighting in their land. It's very different. There have been all kinds of notions that have suggested that maybe Hamas should be offered a deal like the PLO was offered in 1982, which it eventually took. In 1982, the PLO was held up in Beirut in Lebanon. Israel invaded Lebanon and surrounded Beirut. There was a siege. And eventually, the PLO was allowed to evacuate safely. Yasser Arafat left, went to Tunisia. A lot of people have said Israel should be offering this to Yahya Sinwar, saying, just pack up and leave. You can save your life. The war can be over. Sinwar has openly said he would not take that deal. He'd rather die. I will say I genuinely believe him. I think that he would rather die as a martyr to the cause and seeing his cause go on than actually flee. Now, tactically, maybe would some of the leaders have fled, I dare even say, with some hostages in order to save their life and then try to come back later on? That may be. But at this point, it's more likely that they are held up in the Gaza Strip somewhere, I would say.
So, before we get to the ceasefire talks, I got to talk about some of the action up north. We're looking at video from earlier today showing IDF warplanes attacking Hezbollah infrastructure in the Kabria region in Lebanon. I want to ask a big picture question about Hezbollah. The Jerusalem Post says that since the beginning of the current conflict, the IDF has eliminated more than 500 Hezbollah terrorists, including senior commanders. We know Hezbollah is no small foe alone. How much of a dent has been made in Hezbollah's forces since October?
So the significant dent that has been made is less than the amount of fighters that have been killed. Estimates in Israel are 450 to 500. Hezbollah says that it's lost, I think, 365 was the last figure they gave. Um, that's insignificant in the grander scheme of the amount of fighters that Hezbollah has. Israel has, though, assassinated, according to at least the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, he said this a couple of days ago, assassinated upwards of 15 division commanders within Hezbollah. That's a big blow to an organization like Hezbollah, because Hezbollah's military infrastructure relies very much on interpersonal connections. Because it's sort of a state within a state, they don't have as effective a bureaucracy as the Lebanese military. They rely much more on interpersonal connections, people recruiting people, different members knowing where rockets are hidden, right? It's not the same thing as having maps that militaries have. So the assassination of division commanders is likely a big blow to Hezbollah. That said, Hezbollah's force is far from beaten back. The largest blow that Hezbollah has suffered in the war is really what it is suffering in the internal politics in Lebanon. Hezbollah, in addition to being a terrorist organization and having a very active military arm, is also a political party. They run in politics in Lebanon. They run a quote unquote legitimate political party in Lebanon, and they largely are being required by the Lebanese parliament and in some cases by the Lebanese people to answer for what the hell is happening in southern Lebanon. Why have between 80,000 to 150,000 people been forced to evacuate southern Lebanon? Why is Hezbollah dragging Lebanon into a war where we're seeing the pictures where the IDF is decimated? According to some reports, there were satellite images that were published, I forget by which international news agency, I think maybe it was Reuters, I'm not sure, a couple of days ago, that said that the IDF has created an effective buffer zone in Lebanon of 2 to 3 miles simply by carpet bombing the areas of the villages down south. Hezbollah is going to have to answer for that politically. So the larger dent that they have suffered is I would say less militarily. They have a very strong military and they're very backed by Iran. They're both their fighting ranks and the amount of weapons that they've lost. Iran could resupply them in a couple of days. However, internally in Lebanon, they are suffering. And that is one of the main things I would argue that is holding them back from engaging in the war more. They don't want to bring more devastation upon Lebanon because, unlike Hamas in Gaza, let's say a ceasefire is now declared. Like I said before, Hamas is the government they'll rebuild. Hezbollah is not the government in Lebanon. There will be another election in Lebanon, and they will be forced to answer for what happened in Lebanon. So that is one of their main considerations at this point.
Before we go, I believe it was late in May when President Biden held that address where he announced a ceasefire proposal it's been making its way through the system now for weeks and weeks and weeks. Here we stand now, well into July, and still no handshake has happened. There's still no deal, Alon. I know ceasefire talks are still taking place. Is this still that same proposal that Biden introduced back in May? Is this something different? What are we seeing right now?
So essentially, back in May, Biden came out and made public a deal that Israel was willing to agree to, which was immediately denied by Israel and later by Hamas, because that deal included an ultimate ceasefire, which is something that politically Netanyahu cannot allow to happen. His coalition partners, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, and others within his own Likud party have said they will tear down the government before they agree to a ceasefire. So immediately when Biden published this, Netanyahu came out and said, no, that's not what we agreed to. However, it does seem that Israel did agree to that. It was just Netanyahu was trying to postpone the inevitable, recognizing that. What came to his aid is that Hamas rejected that. So then Israel could just come out and say, okay, it doesn't matter if we said yes or no. Hamas rejected that. That deal has then been negotiated and discussed for a long time. The big breakthrough that happened about a week ago is that Hamas gave an official answer in the latest round, because it's always low-level negotiations, in the latest round to the negotiating countries, to Qatar and Egypt, in which it dropped its demand that Israel agree publicly to a complete ceasefire in the first stage of the war. Sorry, the first stage of the deal. So the deal includes 3 phases, and Israel really wants each phase to stand on its own, so that after one phase is completed, certain hostage exchanges, then fighting can resume. Hamas was saying no, a complete ceasefire has to be agreed from phase 1. Now they dropped that, and as a result of them dropping that, there's been a lot of talks about possibly reigniting the ceasefire talks. There is a very, very high-profile meeting that is scheduled to occur on Wednesday in Qatar between the head of the CIA director, William Barnes, head of the Mossad, Dadi Barnea, the Qatari Prime Minister, Mohammed Athani, the head of the Egyptian intelligence, Abbas Kamel. They're all coming together. All this is very good signs. I will say that at this point, it does not look like both sides have come far enough. In Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu immediately put out new demands, 5 terms. One of them included a new demand with regards to the negotiations. Hamas in turn said, well, if that's the case, we're not going forth. It also seems that Hamas did not fully drop that demand for a complete ceasefire. They just moved it to another clause. So there are negotiations happening now. It is based upon Biden's deal from May. It could come to a fold, but there's still a long way to go with regards to if it actually does come to a deal. The optimism that was a week ago saying Hamas dropped that clause, we can get to a deal tomorrow. We're looking at, I would say most optimistically, we would be looking at another 2 or 3 weeks of negotiating to see where it goes, but we'll be smarter even in the coming days to see how that meeting happens on Wednesday and maybe shortly after that.
Of course, this would be the only ceasefire we've seen since the only ceasefire we've seen so far in this most recent chapter of the conflict late last year alone. We'll leave it there for now. Have a good rest of your night.